Open our Bibles tonight to 2 Samuel chapter 13. 2 Samuel chapter 13, begin reading with verse 1. And it came to pass after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. And Amnon was so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and Amnon thought it hard for him to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend. Notice the word but. Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother. And Jonadab was a very subtle man. And he said unto him, Why art thou, being the king's son, lean from day to day? Wilt thou not tell me? And Amnon said unto him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. And Jonadab said unto him, Lay thee down on thy bed, and make thyself sick. And when thy father cometh to see thee, say unto him, I pray thee, let my sister Tamar come and give me meat, and dress the meat in my sight, that I may see it and eat it at her hand. So Amnon lay down and made himself sick. And when the king was come to see him, Amnon said unto the king, I pray thee, let Tamar my sister come and make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat at her hand. Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, Go now to thy brother Amnon's house, and dress him meat. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was laid down, and she took flour and kneaded it, and made cakes in his sight, and did bake the cakes. And she took the pan and poured them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, Have all men out from me. And they went out, every man from him. And Amnon said unto Tamar, Bring the meat into the chamber, that I may eat of thine hand. And Tamar took the cakes which she had made, and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. And when she had brought them unto him to eat, he took hold of her, and said unto her, Come, lie with me, my sister. And she answered him, Nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. And I, whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore, I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee. In other words, let's get married. Let's get married so that this thing is right and proper. Howbeit, he would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than she, forced her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, Arise, be gone. She said unto him, There is no cause. This evil in sending me away is greater than the other that thou didst unto me. But he would not hearken unto her. Then he called his servant that ministered unto him, and said, Put now this woman out from me, and bolt the door after her. The story of Amnon, indeed, is a story of tragedy. It's a story of sorrow. It's a story of heartbreak and a story of shame upon those that perpetrated it. Now, we know from previous lessons that David was not one of the most disciplining fathers that they were. We spent almost a whole lesson showing that David did not use discipline in dealing with his kids. So certainly we could say Amnon felt free to commit this crime because anything he wanted, he had never been told no for. We also know that David was reaping the results of his sin with Bathsheba and his murder of her husband Uriah. So we got two things working. One is a lack of discipline, and the other is the results or consequences of sin. But even though there was a major lack of discipline on the part of David, and even though David was reaping the results of his own sin, we can't put all the blame on David. There comes a point, and I've said this before, Amnon was a grown man, and as a grown man, there comes a time when you have to assume responsibility for your own actions. Even though David was not a disciplinarian, even though David was reaping the results of his sin, Amnon must be held responsible for his own sin. I've said many times, and I'll repeat it as often as I can, regardless of the parents we had, regardless of how good our parents were or how bad our parents were, there comes a point where we as adults must accept the blame for our own actions. While the actions of Amnon were deplorable, I see today there are many people just like Amnon and doing many of the same things that Amnon did. I want to look tonight at this young man, and I want to see what lessons we can learn. And some of the lessons may surprise you, but some of the lessons will be very obvious as we go through. First of all, who is Amnon? We find out in 2 Samuel chapter 3, several chapters back, in verse 2, we find out that Amnon was the firstborn child of David while he was king of Hebron, or the southern kingdom. Years ago, and my wife might remember this, but it's been many years ago, there was a very extensive study done on the birth order of a child and the characteristics of a child born depending on whether they were the oldest, the middle, the youngest, or something else. There was a very extensive study performed on, you're the oldest, here's what we can expect. You're the middle child, here's some characteristics. And in reading that, of course, I was the youngest in our family. My wife was the middle child in her family. And so we read that, and it was amazing with the insights that he could tell about people by their birth order. So Amnon was the first, and I don't remember all of the characteristics. I may have the book somewhere, but in looking at Amnon, he was the oldest. Now, I don't know if this is true in every case, but I know it's true in many, many cases. The oldest is always going to be perfect. Anybody remember your oldest? What was that, Travis? Yeah. Was he perfect? No. Still isn't, is he? Nah. But the oldest child, the first sign of a sniffle, oh, we got to get this kid to a doctor. At the first sign of anything, we're going to have the perfect child. By the time the third, fourth kid comes along, the oldest child, can I hold your baby? No, you might give him a germ. By the time the last one comes along, here, you want him? You can have him. Take him, do whatever. He's blowing his nose, sniffling. He'll be okay, no problem. And if we go through, you'll see certain things and how that affects a child growing up. Amnon was the firstborn son of David while he was king in Hebron. Now, it doesn't relieve his personal responsibility, but it does help us to understand the mind. I was the baby. I was spoiled rotten. I was a lousy, spoiled little baby brat. And I find that true in other instances. But I want you to notice, it said that in our text, in verse 3, but Amnon had a friend. Friendship can be a wonderful thing. I'm thankful that I've got a number of people that I can call friend. I've got a number of preachers that I can talk to. I had one yesterday call me, and it's kind of out of the blue. And he called me and asked me a question, and we got to talking, and we talked for a half hour. There are some people that you just can't help but like them. You can't help, you feel free, you feel comfortable, you can talk to them, you're relaxed around them. It's great to have wonderful friends. They can be a great blessing and a great encouragement. But it's a bad thing when you have a bad friend. The Bible said in the verse we just read, there in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 3, it said that Jonadab was a very subtle man. I looked up the word subtle in Strong's Concordance. It means shrewd. It means crafty, cunning, subtle, deceitful. He was a man who was very crafty. He was the kind of man that, he could always figure out something. He was the guy that was always looking for trouble. He was the guy that was a mastermind of hey, let's do this. Hey, let's do that. He knew how to get what he wanted, and he used deceit to do it. Nothing was too bad, but what a subtle Jonadab couldn't figure out some way to accomplish his plan. As adults, we need to be careful who we listen to. We often talk about peer pressure with young people. And peer pressure is a very real thing. And I can remember in school, if I could remember his name, I could tell you the kid at school that you did not want to be around him. He was always looking for trouble, always daring something, pushing the envelope as far as he could push it. He was the guy that if you hung around, you were going to be guilty of something because he was going to be guilty of something. And we talk about peer pressure. And I'm sure the young people, we've got some that are not here right now. Peer pressure is a very real thing, especially with young people. But I find that peer pressure also can be a very strong thing with adults. As an adult, think about, just for a minute, think about, what would I do, what could I do if it wasn't for my friends? I remember way back when, we were in a different area of the country, and the preachers that were in that area were of the more liberal form. They were the more liberal preachers. I was around them. Most of the preachers we fellowship with were of the more liberal kind. And I remember thinking to myself, well, all of my friends say this is such, or all of my friends are doing this. Maybe I'm the one that's the odd man out. Maybe I'm the one that's wrong. And I find even back then that peer pressure can put a lot of pressure to get you to do things, because let's face it, who wants to be the oddball? Fortunately, and I refer to Brother Harold Harvey a lot, he got a hold of me because I grew up in college with him. He was my second dad in college, and he got a hold of me and said, hey, you're being influenced by these guys, and you don't even know or realize how much they are influencing you. And he kind of pulled me back over and got me more balanced than where I was heading. But friendship can have a great influence, or friendship can drag you down. I know some people right now, you may not know them, but people that were raised in churches just like ours. Their parents were faithful, dedicated Christians just like ours, but they met up with some people that they became good friends with, and their good friend gradually, your pastor said that. Oh, he doesn't know. Hey, I've got my master's degree in Greek and Hebrew, and I can tell you, your pastor is wrong. And I've watched those people go from solid right to central to now leaning left, all because of friendship. Friendship is going to get Amnon in trouble. Friendship is going to push Amnon, give him the encouragement, the push that he needs to end up doing what he ended up doing. There are some people who can take the most black and white, plain, simple verse of Scripture, and when they get through twisting it, they'll have you convinced that right is wrong and wrong is right. And when God said, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves, that really doesn't mean that. When God said, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, it really doesn't mean that. When God says, that we ought to be modest and distinct, well, it really doesn't mean that. And I've seen many people that I grew up with listening to the wrong people and completely turned against everything we were taught. But let's get into Amnon's sin. It says that, and I looked at that clock. We've got the batteries if somebody wants to change it. Let me find out what time it really is, because, yeah. It says in verses 1 and 2, that Amnon had a beautiful sister, fair, meaning beautiful, gorgeous. Everything about her was nearly perfect. And Amnon loved her. He was so vexed with her that it made him sick. He is so in love or in a fantasy with her that it just was on his mind all the time. James chapter 1 says that every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust. My lust may not be the same as yours. Your lust may not be the same as mine. But he is drawn away of his own lust. And when you have a particular weakness in a particular area, Satan then is going to entice you. And I'm back to James. When he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed, Satan finds a way to entice him. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And of course, sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. I want to be very careful, and I got scripture to back me up. Being tempted is not sin. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness. When he came out after 40 days, Matthew chapter, well, I guess I didn't write it down. Matthew says that when he came out, he was tempted of Satan. If temptation itself was sin, then Jesus was tempted. But we know temptation in and of itself is not sin. It's when we allow that temptation to work on our lust and to entice us. And as we'll see with Amnon, we become obsessed with that temptation. And that temptation, that lust, that enticement, when it's conceived, will bring forth sin. But it isn't the temptation. I've heard people say, oh, I'm a terrible sinner. I was tempted. Listen, Satan's job is to tempt you. And then after he has tempted you, he will entice you with everything he's got to get you to commit sin. That's why we have to, as Paul told young Timothy, flee fornication. Flee. Satan will tempt you. Don't stand there and think, oh. At the first sign of temptation, flee, run, get away. People that are tempted with alcohol, don't go to a bar and think, I'm just going to stand there and look in. Satan will tempt you. He will entice you. And then that will take over your reasoning. That'll take over your thought processes. And before you know it, that temptation you have yielded to, you didn't flee at the first sign. And sin and that temptation led to sin. And then sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. We often underestimate Satan. None of us do this, I'm sure. But a lot of people think of Satan as having two horns, a long tail, and a pitchfork. That's not how Satan tempts us. If your weakness is lust, he is going to bring the most beautiful, gorgeous, well-rounded lady that you can think of, and put her in your path. If your temptation is alcohol, he's going to make sure that you are put into a position to where your weakness will be the area he works on. He knows your weakness. He knows what your weaknesses are, and he knows how to literally to tempt you, to entice you, and to get you to sin. That's his job. Amnon lusted after his half-sister. Now, she's called sister, but if you go back and look at her genealogy, look at Amnon's genealogy, they had the same father, but they had different mothers. So they were technically half-brother and half-sister. But he began to think, oh, my sister is so beautiful. Now, I've said before, please don't misunderstand. There is a difference between an honest compliment and lusting. Big, huge difference. Your temptation, your weakness is kleptomania. How many of you know what kleptomania is? Okay, I'll give you a short, easy answer. Kleptomania is someone who cannot help themselves or keep themselves from stealing. Kleptomania is simply stealing. Someone who is almost addicted. Who was that famous girl? Her parents were multi-millionaires years ago, and she was caught stealing a very cheap nothing from the store. It wasn't a lack of money. She had more money than she could ever spend, but she was addicted. She was a kleptomaniac, and she just couldn't help her. Did I pronounce that wrong? She was whatever. She couldn't help herself from stealing. Whatever your temptation is, Satan knows your weak spot. I never was a wrestler, fighter, but I've talked to those, and when you fight someone, you try to find out their weakness, and then you play on their weakness. That's exactly what Satan does. But in Amnon's case, it was much more than a fleeting thought. You know, Satan's job is to put the thought in your mind. Your job, with the help of the Holy Spirit, is to get that thought out of your mind. But Satan puts it there. Wow, my sister is beautiful. And then, I wonder. And he began to think. And the more he thought, the more vexed he became. It became an obsession. He thought about it. He dwelt on it. He just couldn't figure out how to accomplish it. And that's where Jonadab comes in. He began to imagine what it would be like. And of course, the more you think about anything, the more you imagine anything, the longer you dwell on it, the longer you think about it, the greater chance that you will eventually yield to it. So he shared this passion with his good friend Jonadab, and being the sly, subtle man that he was, he came up with a way to accomplish his goal. His advice included everything from lying, cheating, deceiving, and even using physical force. That's why I said you need to be so careful who your friends are. As parents, that's why you need to be careful who your kids hang out with. My mom and dad didn't have the internet, but they had ways of doing a background check on anybody that I was even thinking about going out with. we didn't have the internet, but we had the telephone, and everybody knew everybody, and it's like, well, what do you know about John Doe? Oh, and they could always find out something. But the more you think about it, the more you begin to imagine, how could I accomplish this? Parents, you need to know who your kids are hanging out with. As adults, you need to be careful who your friends are. There's a lot of people. I worked in secular work for several years, and you got 30 minutes to eat lunch, and so you got 30 minutes, the buzzer goes off, you go to the lunchroom, you eat your sandwich, and I eventually started going out to my car and eating lunch in my car because I couldn't stand to listen to all they were saying, all the things. I did not want that in my mind, so I would go out in my car and listen to the radio and eat lunch because I don't want those friends. I don't want those kind of people filling my mind with thoughts and actions and all of those things. Jonadab said, now to accomplish this, you're going to have to lie to your dad. You're going to have to lie to Tamar. You're going to have to lie to everybody involved. You're going to have to be crafty and deceitful, but it'll be worth it in the end. You'll accomplish what you want. Listen. No, I'll save that for the closing. Amnon could have married Tamar, had a wedding, married her, everything would have been fine. But wait a minute, she was his half-sister. And I don't have time to get into the genetic pool, but in the beginning, Adam and Eve, their DNA, their genes were perfectly pure. There were no accidents in the DNA. There were no, problems. Their DNA was pure. You could marry your sister without fear of all the things we would fear today. Where did Cain get his wife? The easy answer is he married his sister. Abraham married his half-sister. And so it was not uncommon. And even in David's day, you could marry a next of kin, and the gene pool was still pure enough that you could have normal children. Today, we've got 6,000 years of bombardment in our genes and DNA that if you married your sister today, it's almost 100%. Your offspring will be deformed or defective in some way. But she said, hey, all you got to do is ask Dad. Dad will give me in marriage. I will be married. You can have what you want. You can have me, and everything will be fine. Nope, I don't want to wait. I want what I want, and I want it now. I'm not going to wait for marriage. I want now. And she resisted. And so it said that he, being stronger than her, forced her. Forced her. He raped her. Then his hatred for her exceeded his love for her in the beginning. Be careful what you put in your mind. Be careful what you read. It's been, maybe a year or so ago, and I doubt if it's changed, but pornography is a multi-billion dollar a year industry. Not million, billion. Multi-billion dollar industry, because they're feeding on men's natural desires, feeding their lust, and making a fortune into it. That's why Paul said in 2 Corinthians 10, bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. You got to watch what you think about. You got to watch what goes in your mind. You got to watch what you hear, what advice you take. Jesus himself said in Matthew 15, for out of the heart proceedeth evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, and blasphemies. But it starts in the heart with what we hear, what we see, what we read, what we think about. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. You dwell on these things. You dwell on sin. You dwell on lust, whether it be, whatever. You dwell on it, and Satan will make certain that you get an opportunity to act on that sin. That's why you have to bring every thought into captivity and guard your heart. As he said, every thought, bring it into the obedience of Christ. Because what you think is what you will probably act on. Then he kicked her out. Bible doesn't say why he kicked her out, just that he kicked her out after he used and abused her. And I couldn't help but think, as I was thinking about this, sin is seldom as enjoyable as we dreamed it would be. In Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about Moses. And it said that Moses, choosing rather to suffer afflictions with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. The pleasures of sin are just for a season. It may be a few minutes, maybe a few days, maybe even a few years. But sin's pleasure will eventually fade away. I've talked to many couples, and when they're fighting, having problems, thinking about divorce or divorcing, and I almost always tell them the same thing with some variation. The grass may look greener on the other side, but it still has to be mowed. Let that soak in. The problems you have with this wife, this other lady doesn't have those same problems. But she's got problems just like your first wife. All you're doing is trading one set of problems for a different set of problems, but you're still going to have problems. Sin is only for a short season. It only lasts for a short time. And once the sin and all of its passion is over, it's like I traded everything I had for that. Sometimes it leads to guilt. Sometimes it leads to fear of the consequences. But sin is only for a season. Just a short season. So what does the Bible say about us? And I want to emphasize this without undue speculation, every one of us have our weaknesses. I don't know what yours are. Hopefully you don't know what mine are. But every one of us have weaknesses. And Satan knows every one of our weaknesses. Satan will make certain that in your area of weakness, that you are tempted in that area. I can guarantee you that. Especially if you're trying to serve God, He is not going to let you serve God without a fight on your hands. Understand, we are all weak in different areas, but every one of us have our weak spots. Number 2, pick friends that will help you in your Christian life. I have a fairly firm rule, and I've explained the difference between an acquaintance and a friend. An acquaintance is somebody I know, I recognize, I could speak to on the street. You know, I could even stop and talk to them for a few minutes. A friend is someone that I could go to lunch with and enjoy. A friend is someone that I can feel comfortable about. I do not want friends. In fact, like I said, I started going to my car and eating when I was working in a factory. I don't want friends that are always going to be talking about what they would like to do with whom. I want friends that are going to encourage me. I want friends that are going to say, hey, I know you're going through some tough times. Is there anything I can do to help you? I had a very good friend of mine, and I've got, in my list, I've got friends and very good friends. This was a very good friend several years ago. He called me one day, and I knew from his voice something was not right. So I said, what's going on? And they were having a major crisis in the church he pastored. Major crisis. And so I listened, I couldn't offer much advice. I've never gone through that. But I mainly listened, encouraged him where I could. And later, he said, you know what? You helped me more than all the other preachers I called and all the other people I talked to. I want friends that are going to encourage me, lift me up, not always tell me how to cheat and get away with various things. Be careful of friends that are always scheming to get by with. Beware of friends who you have to practice deceit or remain secretive. Don't tell your dad what your real purpose is. Now, I'm going to sidetrack just for a little, and I got it in my notes to make sure that I do sidetrack. Some of you, I know, are very much aware. Some of you who don't have kids or grandkids in school, you may not be as aware. But right now, the battle for our kids is raging. Raging in our public schools. How do you know? Well, during COVID, one of the bad things that happened, which ended up being a good thing, is the lockdown. It was a mistake. Fauci should be treated for treason. He's the one that pushed it. But one good thing came out of the lockdown. Kids had to study in school at home. Many of them live via it's Facebook on your phone. What's it called on TV? I'm sorry. Talking about where you watch your class in school, whatever that's called. And parents, for the first time, got to see and hear what was being taught their kids in school. And it caused parents to rise up in righteous indignation. Do you know, and I just read this last week, I think it was, in kindergarten, they are being shown full-blown pornography under the guise kids need to know this stuff. They do, but not at 5 years of age. Here's the kicker, and this is where when parents found out, they hit the ceiling. The kids were being told, don't tell your parents. Your parents won't like it if they find out. As young as kindergarten, they're being groomed. Now, I know what groomed meant when I was a kid. You know, I'd spend half hour slicking my hair down, making sure I had enough Brill cream, and making sure that, I was well groomed and looked nice. Spray a little extra aftershave so I would smell nice. That's not what grooming is today. Grooming today is, you're a boy, not you, you're a boy. Do you know you might really be a girl trapped inside of a boy's body? It's called grooming. You begin grooming these kids to become a transgender later on. Did you know in some states that they can groom your child and they can give your child puberty blockers to stop the natural hormones from developing? And the parents don't know anything about it. Not every school, but nationwide, it is the vast majority of schools. Did you know girls can be taken out of school, taken someplace, have an abortion? And it's like, don't you tell your parents. Well, anytime something has to be kept secret, it automatically shoots up a red flag for me. If it's so bad, I can't tell my parents, and you're told, don't tell your parents, like Amnon, don't tell your dad the truth. Your dad will never agree to send Tamar over. If you tell your dad the truth, you cannot tell your dad what you're doing. Anytime something has to be kept secret, instantly, man, my red flags go up faster than you can imagine. The other thing, and this is being taught not in every school, but in the majority. You know the reason you got a house? Because you're white. You're a white supremacist. You know the reason you got a car? You're a white supremacist. They're being taught that if you have anything, you're a white supremacist and you need to repent and make it up to those who aren't white. And it's all, don't tell your parents. Don't tell them. What's that got to do with us? I said this morning I would line this in with our coming services this week. As we think about our upcoming service, I hope I hope that every one of our members is truly praying for revival. But I want you to examine yourself this week. Is there anything in your mind or in your heart that you're festering and it's keeping you from truly serving God? Is there anything? Amnon began with the thought, but he dwelt on it and dwelt on it. I'm asking every one of us, examine ourselves. Is there anything in my mind or in my heart that would keep me from experiencing a real revival? Is there anything that has me out of fellowship with God? Do you think Amnon was close to God when he's lusting and, living it and reliving it in his mind? I'm asking every one of us, examine ourselves this week and say, Lord, cleanse me. Know my thoughts. See if there be any bad thing in me. We look at Amnon and say, oh, terrible guy. But there may be things in our mind, in our heart, that if we carried them to fruition, would be just as bad as anything Amnon